She laughed at something he said, and the sound of it carried across the whole restaurant. Marcus heard it from 2 tables over. He didn't look up right away. He took a long sip of his water, set the glass down with 2 fingers, and watched the condensation ring it left on the white tablecloth. Then he looked. Sela was leaning forward in her seat the way she only leaned when she was genuinely delighted, chin tilted down, one shoulder raised, fingers curled around her glass of wine. The man across from her, the one she'd introduced as an old university contact, was grinning with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his whole life being found charming. He reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She let him. Marcus looked back at his plate. The food had gone cold. He cut a small piece of something, he'd forgotten what he'd ordered, and chewed it slowly. And while he chewed, he made a quiet decision that had been building for approximately 11 months. He left cash on the table, more than the bill required, and stood up. On his way out, he passed their table. He didn't stop, didn't slow his pace, didn't make eye contact with either of them. He just walked. He was almost at the door when he heard Sela's chair scrape, the sound of her suddenly realizing, but by then he was already out in the cold night air and moving. The woman he nearly collided with was standing just outside the entrance, scrolling her phone with one hand and holding a set of car keys in the other. She had the look of someone waiting for a reservation to open up, patient but slightly annoyed at having been made to wait. When Marcus nearly knocked her over, she caught his arm to steady them both, and they stood for a moment in a tangled near apology, neither of them quite sure who had turned unexpectedly into whom. "Sorry," he said. "You look like you need a drink," she said. She wasn't wrong. Her name was Ewan, and she was waiting for a friend who had just texted to cancel. She was also, it turned out, the kind of person who found accidental collisions with shell-shocked strangers mildly interesting rather than irritating. She suggested the bar 2 doors down. Marcus had nowhere else to be, and more to the point, nowhere he particularly wanted to go. He didn't tell her about Sela. She didn't ask. They talked about other things, her work in materials engineering, his background in translation and literary editing, the strange particular loneliness of cities at night, how the best places to eat in any city were always on streets that were slightly inconvenient to get to. She ordered something complicated involving 2 liqueurs he didn't recognize. He ordered whatever she was having. It was good. An hour passed without either of them noticing. When Sela's contact finally found him, moving through the bar with his jacket open and his jaw set, and the expression of a man who has just discovered that his evening has taken a turn he did not plan for, Marcus saw him first. The man scanned the room the way people scan rooms when they already know what they're looking for, but are hoping they're wrong. He stopped at their table, he looked at Marcus, he looked at Ewan. "That's my wife," he said. Not to Marcus, to the room, to the situation. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say on the walkover and was now delivering it to a scene that was nothing like the one he'd rehearsed for. A silence expanded between the 3 of them like a room filling with water. Ewan looked at the man with an expression Marcus would later describe to his sister over the phone as profoundly and deliberately unimpressed. She set down her glass with a soft click. She said very calmly, "I know." Marcus would find out later, because Ewan told him, 3 weeks after that night, over the same complicated drinks in the same bar, that she and Sela's contact had been separated for 8 months. That the marriage had been a casualty of distance, of competing visions of what a life was supposed to look like, and of a fundamental disagreement about whether the life they had was the life they wanted or simply the life they'd ended up in. That she had not, in fact, been waiting for a restaurant reservation when she'd run into Marcus. She'd been standing outside gathering the nerve to go back in and retrieve a coat she'd left there during an argument the week before. A green coat, heavy wool, that she'd had for years. She'd left in too much anger to stop for it, and by the time the anger had cooled it had seemed too small a reason to go back. But a week of cold had changed her assessment of the situation. He would also find out that she thought he was funny, in a dry, unhurried way she hadn't encountered in a long time. That she liked the way he listened, not performing interest, but actually tracking. That she'd been curious enough about him, after that first night, to find the translation anthology he mentioned having contributed to and read his author's note twice. But that was 3 weeks later. On the night itself, Marcus simply said, to the man standing at their table with his open jacket and his planned speech about to turn to ash, "I think you might want to sit down." He didn't mean it kindly. He said it the way you say something when you know the other person is only beginning to understand the shape of what's happened to them, and you have the particular advantage of being a few steps further along, not because you're smarter, but because your version of the evening's revelation came 20 minutes earlier, and you've already started metabolizing it. The man sat down. Marcus did not. He paid for the drinks, both of their drinks, the full tab including the complicated thing they'd each had twice, buttoned his coat, and said good night to Ewan with the careful composure of a man who was mostly faking it, and suspected she knew he was mostly faking it and didn't particularly mind. She watched him go with an expression that could have meant several things. He decided, walking out into the cold, not to spend too much time parsing which one. Outside, he stood on the pavement for a moment. The night air was cold enough to bite. The city went on around him, taxis, voices, the blur of someone running for a bus, and he stood in the middle of all of it feeling very small and also, for the first time in a long while, like a very specific and clearly defined small, not diffuse. Not spread thin across the task of trying to be what someone else needed, just himself, standing in the cold, present. He started walking. He didn't know where, it didn't matter. The walking itself was the point. The thing about grief is that it doesn't announce itself with any appropriate dignity. It doesn't arrive in a single dramatic wave. It moves in during ordinary moments, while you're making coffee, while you're reading a transit map, while you're standing in a supermarket aisle holding 2 identical cans of something and understanding, with a sudden clarity that is almost funny, that you only need one now. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks learning the geography of a life that had shed one of its major landmarks. He came home to a flat that was suddenly, exhaustingly quiet. Not peacefully quiet, the wrong kind, the kind that has edges. He ate at odd hours and forgot what he'd eaten within the hour. He left books open face down on surfaces he immediately forgot he'd been reading on. He called his sister twice and talked to her for 4 minutes each time, unable to explain what he was actually feeling without sounding either dramatically bereaved or pathetically understated. And the truth was somewhere more complicated than either. What he was actually feeling was something he didn't have a word for in English. He'd spent enough years working in translation to know that the English language had suspicious gaps, places where other languages had precise, even beautiful terms for specific human experiences that English could only approximate with clumsy combinations of other words. There was a Mandarin concept he'd struggled with in a text he'd worked on some years back, something that didn't map cleanly onto grief or loss or loneliness. More like the version of yourself that existed inside someone else's perception of you, the version that was shaped by their seeing that leaned into their attention. When they leave or when you leave, that version of you is unmoored. It has nowhere to be. It wanders. He'd written a note about it in the margin of his working copy back then. He dug it out now, found it in a stack of papers he'd shoved under the bed during a cleaning fit 6 months ago, exactly where things went to be forgotten about until you needed them. The note said, like losing a home you didn't know you were living in. He read it sitting on the floor next to the bed, still holding the other papers he'd moved to get to it. Then he emailed Ewan. The email said, "I thought about what you said the other night about whether things have inherent purpose or whether we construct meaning retroactively. I've been thinking about it more than I expected to. Also, I think I owe you a drink." She replied in 11 minutes, "You definitely owe me a drink. I'll tell you about the coat." They met on a Tuesday, which became a pattern neither of them formally decided on. Tuesdays were good. They had a neutrality to them, not the complicated weight of weekends, not the diminished patience of Mondays. It rained the second time they met, which meant the bar was half empty, and they got the table by the window without waiting. Ewan ordered the complicated drink again. This time Marcus ordered the same thing on purpose rather than accident, and he noticed that it tasted better when you knew what you were drinking. Small revelation. He filed it. She told him about the coat, about the argument that had preceded the coat, about the 8 months of slow realization that she and her husband had been performing a marriage that had stopped containing any actual marriage somewhere around year 3. The way you could go through all the correct motions of a shared life, the shared meals and the shared mortgage and the shared friends who showed up at the shared dinner table, and realize one Tuesday, it was always a Tuesday, she said, laughing at this, that you were looking at someone you'd loved genuinely but no longer knew, and worse, that you were not particularly sure they knew you either. She talked about it with the unsentimental clarity of someone who had already done the hardest work of understanding the situation and was now simply reporting the findings. No performance of pain, no bid for sympathy. Just, this is what happened, this is what it meant, this is where we are. Marcus found this profoundly restful. He hadn't known he needed it to be restful until it was. "How long were you together?" he asked. 6 years total, 2 good, 1 genuinely complicated, 3 where we were mostly just 2 people who happened to share a kitchen and a set of habits. She turned her glass in a slow circle on the table, watching it. "How long were you with her?" 11 months. That's a strange amount of time. It was always a strange situation. She was never quite fully there. I don't mean she was dishonest. I mean she was always partly elsewhere looking for something else, and I thought, he stopped. He hadn't talked about this to anyone. I thought presence was something that could be earned, if you were consistent enough, patient enough. I thought it was a patience problem. "It isn't," said Ewan. "No. You learn that." "I'm learning it now." She nodded, not sympathetically, exactly. More like acknowledging a fact that had been true before this conversation and would continue being true after. He appreciated that. He'd gotten enough sympathy in the past 3 weeks to float something considerably larger than a boat. What he hadn't gotten was anyone willing to sit with the fact of the thing without immediately trying to fix it, reframe it into something more manageable, or deliver the assured prediction that something better was coming. Sympathy, he was beginning to understand, was sometimes a way of not looking directly at a thing. "Can I tell you something that sounds strange?" she said. "Yes." "I don't think you're sad about her specifically. I think you're sad about the version of yourself that existed inside that relationship. Like, that person doesn't have anywhere to go now. It's walking around looking for a place to be, and there isn't one." He looked at her for a long moment. "I told you it sounded strange," she said. "I had a note about that," he said. "Almost exactly that. From a translation I was working on years ago. I couldn't find the right English word for it, so I wrote a note about what it felt like instead." "What did the note say?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate," she said. "That's very accurate." She was a materials engineer by training, had taken a double major in classical literature as an undergraduate, mostly out of stubbornness, and a mild competitive streak about being the only engineer in her cohort who could explain the Zhuangzi, and she knew enough about the tradition Marcus was drawing from to follow the thread. They spent the better part of an hour on it. The difficulty of translating states of being that don't have direct equivalents. The way translation was, at its best, not the replacement of one word with another, but the building of a new container that could hold the same pressure. She had opinions that were sharp and specific and occasionally wrong in ways she would admit to, which was its own kind of quality. He found himself pushing back on her and enjoying it. When the bar started filling up around 8, neither of them suggested leaving. There is a version of this story that goes simply: two people meet under strange circumstances, orbit each other for a while, fall into something. That version is not false exactly, but it leaves out everything that made the story worth telling. The architecture without the light. The light in this case was in the details. It was in the Tuesday nights that became a habit without anyone formally proposing that they should be. In the way Ewan laughed, sudden, complete, nothing held back, the kind of laugh that made people at adjacent tables look over briefly and then smile without knowing why. In the way Marcus cooked, which was meticulous to the point of comedy and absurdly serious about small details that arguably didn't matter, and how Ewan started appearing in his kitchen on weekend afternoons and treating the preparation of food as a collaborative engineering problem with specific variables and testable outcomes, which turned out to be exactly the right approach and produced, over several months, genuinely excellent results. It was in the conversation they had, 2 months in, over dinner at his place. She'd brought wine. He'd produced something ambitious and slightly overcomplicated about what they were actually doing with each other. She initiated it. She was direct in a way that Marcus, who had spent 11 months trying to read weather patterns in someone else's silences, found almost physically relaxing. There was no subtext, or rather, the subtext was the text, stated plainly and offered without drama. "I want to be clear about what this is," she said, "because I've spent 6 years being unclear about what something was, and it cost me a significant amount." "Okay," he said. "I like you. I think you're interesting and I enjoy spending time with you, and I'd like to keep doing that with some regularity. But I'm not in a hurry and I'm not looking for something to rescue me from anything. I'm not performing a recovery. I'm present here, with you. That's what I've got to offer." He looked at her across the table for a moment. "That's everything I was looking for," he said. "I didn't know that's what I was looking for until you just described it." She held his gaze for a second, checking that he meant it. Then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to the problem of the dish in front of her, which had a structural issue she was now fairly sure could be resolved with more acid. He watched her work and thought about the word *home, about how it was one of the words that didn't translate cleanly, that meant different things depending on what you needed it to mean. He'd spent a year building something he called home inside someone who was always partly pointing somewhere else. He was starting to understand, in a way that felt less like a realization than a slow adjustment of vision, that presence was the architecture. Everything else was furniture. You could have all the right furniture in a space with no walls and you'd still be outside. Sela called once. It was a Saturday morning 4 months after the restaurant, and Marcus was in the middle of making coffee, the morning ritual he'd reclaimed as his own, an uncomplicated pleasure, when his phone lit up with her name. He stood there for 3 full rings deciding what he wanted from the next 60 seconds, what he owed her, what he owed himself. He answered. "I didn't handle things well," she said. She didn't say hello first. It was one of the things he'd once found disarming about her, the way she could move straight to the point, bypassing the comfortable padding of preamble. It worked better when the point she was moving to was good news. "No," he agreed. "I've been thinking about it, what I was doing, what I was looking for in. I don't think I was honest with you about what I needed." "You weren't." A pause. "Is that all you're going to say?" He thought about it. Outside his window, the city was going about its Saturday morning, bins being collected somewhere down the street, a bus sighing to a stop at the corner, someone playing music 2 floors up that he couldn't quite make out, the ordinary texture of a morning that had nothing to apologize for. "I think we were both looking for something," he said finally. "I think neither of us was quite present enough to see that what we were looking for wasn't in each other. I don't think you were malicious. I think you were searching. I was searching too, differently. That's very generous of you. I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. I've had 4 months to understand the situation. Another pause, longer this time. Are you okay? She asked. He could hear the genuine question in it. She wasn't asking to confirm that he wasn't okay, wasn't asking so she could feel absolved or worried or necessary. She was asking because she actually wanted to know. Yes, he said. And then because it was true and because he hadn't expected it to be so simply, cleanly, uncomplicatedly true. Yes, I'm genuinely okay. He could hear her processing that. The pause had a specific quality, the surprise of the answer, and maybe the slight strange sting of it. Good, she said. I'm glad, I mean it. He believed her. She wasn't a villain. She'd never been a villain, only human, which was a category that contained enormous variety, every possible combination of good intention and poor execution, of genuine feeling and incomplete honesty, of searching and landing wrong. She had searched and landed wrong. So had he, in his own direction. The only difference was the nature of the miscalculation. After they hung up, he finished making the coffee and took it to the window and stood there drinking it in the morning light, and the feeling that moved through him was not triumph and not grief and not even relief, exactly. It was something quieter than all of those. Something like the specific piece of a story that has finally resolved into its correct shape. The shape it was always going to be, that you couldn't see while you were still inside it. He texted Ewan, "Can you come over? I want to tell you something." She replied 6 minutes later, bringing soup. "The structural issue has been resolved. I'll explain." He laughed. It surprised him, the completeness of it, the way it took up the whole room. Here is what he told her when she came. He told her about the note in the margin, about the 11 months of trying to earn presents from someone who was already elsewhere, the specific texture of that particular kind of loneliness. How it was different from ordinary loneliness because there was someone there, right there, and yet the space stayed empty. He told her about the 3 weeks afterward, the flat with edges to the silence. About the strange, specific weightlessness of walking out into the cold, after making a decision he'd been approaching for almost a year, without letting himself arrive at it. He told her, "I spent a long time in a version of my own life that was mostly waiting room. I kept furnishing it, kept trying to make it feel like an actual place. I thought that was the problem, the furniture. I kept moving it around, changing arrangements. I didn't understand that there were no walls." She was sitting on his couch with her legs folded under her, hands wrapped around a mug of the soup she'd brought, watching him with the particular attention he'd come to recognize as hers, not performing listening, actually listening. "The concept you're describing," she said, when he'd stopped talking. "The wandering self. I know a word for it in Cantonese that's not exact but closer than anything English has." "Tell me." She told him. He sat with the sound of it, turning it over. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's it. That's exactly the shape of it." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. Her eyes were steady. They held something that wasn't pity and wasn't sympathy, wasn't even compassion exactly. It was simpler than all of those and therefore more useful. It was witness. The clean, unremarkable act of being seen clearly by someone who wasn't trying to fix you or reframe you or reassure you into something more comfortable. Just seeing. "You're here now," she said. Not a question, not reassurance. An observation offered the way you'd offer a hand. "I'm here," he said. Outside, the city did what cities do, ground forward in its noise, and its neon, and its indifferent vitality. Inside, 2 people sat with soup that had solved its structural problems, and old words that didn't exist in English, and the specific warmth of a situation that had arrived through accident and stayed through choice. He didn't think in that moment about the restaurant, about the hair being tucked behind the ear, the laugh carrying across the room, the cold walk into the night. Those things had happened and they were real, and they had led, in their crooked and entirely unplanned way, directly here. Which was, as far as he could tell, exactly where they were supposed to be. The coat, he found out eventually, was green. A heavy dark wool thing she'd had for years, that she'd bought at a market stall in her second year of university, when she was broke enough that she'd needed it to last a decade, and it had, stubbornly, complied. Deeply unfashionable in the specific way of things that were once practical and became vintage without passing through stylish. She'd left it on the back of a chair during the argument because she'd been too angry to stop and retrieve it, and by the time the anger had cooled to something manageable, it had seemed too small a thing to go back for. "But you went back," he said. "A week of cold changed my cost-benefit analysis. Did you get it?" Eventually. She glanced up from whatever she was working on, papers spread across his kitchen table, a materials calculation he'd learned not to interrupt. "The restaurant people had it in their lost and found. I got to the door and then stood there for 20 minutes before going in, which is when you nearly knocked me over. So if you'd had more nerve, you would have already been inside." "If I'd had more nerve, I would have been inside, and you would have walked out onto an empty pavement, and had your very private crisis entirely on your own, and we would never have met." He thought about that. "I'm very grateful for your nerve situation," he said. "It has improved significantly since then." She went back to the papers. "Don't read into it." He didn't, but he thought about it for a while, about how entire lives turned on things that were almost not. The coat almost left behind permanently. The friend who almost didn't cancel. The restaurant almost not chosen. The table almost different. The moment before the door almost walked through without stopping. He thought this is what the old concept meant, maybe. The wandering self was not just a metaphor for inner experience. It was also literal. The self that moves through possibilities, barely touching most of them, occasionally landing on one that holds. The self that was almost somewhere else entirely and then wasn't. The structural issue with the soup, when she finally explained it, turned out to involve an acidity imbalance she'd identified by cross-referencing 3 different recipes and determining that each was compensating for the same fundamental error in a slightly different way. She had fixed it by going back to first principles. What should the soup actually taste like, stripped of inherited assumptions? Then she built toward that. "That's how you approach most things," he said. "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation." She considered. "I suppose it is. It's faster." "It's very efficient," he said. "It's also occasionally alarming to watch you apply it to things that are supposed to be intuitive." Intuition is pattern recognition that's running fast enough to feel like instinct. There's no reason not to slow it down and look at the pattern. There's something lost when you do that. Like what? He thought about it. The moment before understanding, the gap where the thing is still mysterious. She looked at him. "You like the gap." "I work in the gap. Translation is almost entirely the gap. The space between what one language can do and what another can't, and how you build a bridge in the dark." She was quiet for a moment. The way she went quiet when she was genuinely thinking about something rather than formulating a response. "I think you're better in the gap than I am," she said finally. "I want to resolve it." "I know. Does that bother you?" "No, I think we need both." She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, "I think we do." It was one of those conversations. He had a growing collection of them by now, filed away not as memories exactly but as reference points, coordinates, that didn't seem significant while it was happening and became significant in retrospect. The quiet agreements about how 2 people were different and whether the difference worked. The assessment of the gap. It worked. A year in, they made it official in the pragmatic sense. She gave up her flat. He acquired a spare set of keys to his. and they had a brief and entirely practical conversation about storage space that concluded with her donating 3 boxes of things she'd been keeping for no reason, and him constructing a new bookshelf to house the overflow from her collection, which turned out to be substantially larger than she'd mentioned and substantially better curated than he'd expected. There was no ceremony to it, no designated moment. One Thursday she had more of her things there than not, and they were both fine with that, and then it was true. He told his sister during one of their phone calls. His sister, who had been carefully not asking about this for 8 months, said, "I thought so. Tell me about her." He tried. He found, as he often found with things that mattered, that the summary flattened them. She's an engineer. She makes a very good soup. She has a green coat she's had since university. She told me something true about grief before she knew my name. "She sounds good for you," his sister said. "She is. You sound different." "I think I am." He paused. "I'm more present, I think, in my own life, in my actual life." "You were always thoughtful," his sister said, "but you used to feel like you were always slightly elsewhere." He hadn't known she'd noticed. He probably should have. "I know," he said. "I know I was." The work changed. This surprised him slightly. He'd expected the rest of his life to improve, and it had in the ways he'd anticipated, but he hadn't expected his work to shift the way it did. He'd been a competent translator for years, technically proficient, accurate. He won small commissions, produced reliable work, was respected in the circles where that kind of work was respected, which were not large circles but were genuine ones. After, he didn't have a cleaner word for it, after asterisk, the work acquired something he'd been missing without knowing it was missing. A willingness to sit with uncertainty, to not resolve the gap too quickly, to trust that the reader could hold the tension of a word that was only approximately right, that carried its approximateness as part of its meaning. He worked on a collection of classical poetry that winter. The poet in question had lived in exile and written about the nature of the soul, its wandering, its homesickness, its impossible desire to return to a place that no longer existed in the form it remembered. Poems that were, fundamentally, about the untranslatability of longing. Marcus spent weeks on a single poem. He wrote 7 versions of the central stanza, each one resolving the ambiguity differently, each one losing something the others preserved. He wrote a long note about it, not in the margin this time, but a full document, the kind that would eventually become his translator's preface, about how some texts don't want to be resolved, about how the gap is part of the content. When the collection came out the following autumn, it received the kind of reception that was modest in scale but exact in quality. A small prize from an organization he respected, reviews from people who understood what he'd been trying to do, a letter from a reader, just one, typed on actual paper, sent to his publisher and forwarded to him, that said, "I have been trying to explain this feeling for 20 years and you found it." He kept the letter in the kitchen drawer, next to Ewan's soup notebook. On an evening in late spring, when the city had finally remembered that it was capable of warmth and exercised this capability with a kind of excessive enthusiasm, they went to a night market 2 metro stops from the flat. These were the things you learned to love about cities, the specific pleasures they produced when they were being their best selves, the particular kindness of warmth after a long winter. The market was the kind of beautiful mess that cities produce when they have too much to contain: noise, light, the smell of everything cooking at once, people pressed close in the good way, the way that meant something was happening and everyone had chosen to be part of it. They moved through it together, not always side by side. She was drawn to a ceramic stall where someone was selling handmade pieces in colors he recognized, the specific muted greens and yellows she tended toward. He drifted to a second-hand bookseller with an improbable selection and worse organization, which was usually where the good finds were. They found each other again in the middle of the crowd, having not coordinated it, as had become the pattern. She had bought a bowl, Green, obviously. He had bought a text in a language he hadn't worked with in 2 years, held it with the grip of someone who has just recognized something they didn't know they were looking for. Good, she asked. Very. He turned it over. It's going to take me months. The vocabulary operates in categories that don't exist in English, whole areas of experience that my target language can only approach sideways. How do you translate something that doesn't have a container? You build one, imperfect. You trust the reader to feel where the edges are. She tilted her head, considering. That's a kind of elegance. It's also heartbreaking every time. She took his free hand. He held the book in the other. They stood in the middle of the crowd in all the noise and warmth and specific vivid pressure of a city being fully alive at night. And it was a moment, just a moment, completely ordinary and not ordinary at all, and it passed the way all moments pass into the thing that lasts. Later, walking home, the city cooling around them, the market noise fading. Do you think about how accidental it all was? She said. He thought about it. The question deserved the courtesy of a real answer. Less than I used to. In the beginning, I kept tracing it back, trying to find the exact point where it could have gone differently. The friend who canceled, the coat, the table I was at, the table they were at 2 tables over. He paused. But I think that's the wrong question, or not the wrong question, an incomplete one. What's the complete one? He looked at her, green coat, green bowl, hair loose in the spring air. The bowl tucked under one arm with the carelessness of someone who trusts the things she's chosen to hold. What you do with where you ended up. She was quiet for a moment. The city moved around them. Somewhere ahead, a set of traffic lights changed. I ended up here, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. The word asterisk here landed the way the right translation lands, not perfectly equivalent to what it was reaching for, but close enough to hold the pressure. Here, this moment. Here, this city. Here, this person, this choice made continually, quietly, without drama, every Tuesday and every Saturday and every ordinary morning with coffee by the window. Here. Ahead of them, the city opened into itself. The stacked signs and the layered lives and the river somewhere beyond the buildings, dark and patient and very old, moving with the indifference of things that will continue long after the people walking beside them have come and gone and been replaced. The sky overhead, wide open, offering nothing and everything. He thought about wandering souls, about the ancient poet who had walked into a river carrying 2,000 years of grief he'd turned into language so precise it was still arriving, about the strange alchemy of consciousness passed forward through time, the idea that experience didn't end, it transformed, that it looked for new containers, that it kept moving. He thought about the version of himself that had stood outside a restaurant in the cold, lightened of something heavy, walking into the unknown specificity of what came next. He thought about all the selves between that one and this one, the one who slept badly in a flat with too many edges, the one who wrote an email not knowing exactly why, the one who sat at a Tuesday table and heard the words that finally fit the feeling he'd been carrying for years without a name for it. He was all of them, and he was not exactly any of them, and he was the thread that ran through them. The one who noticed, the one who wrote things in margins, the one who paid for drinks and walked into cold air and kept moving and eventually, not by plan but by accumulated choice, arrived. He held her hand, he held the book. He walked home. The bread took 4 attempts. She approached it the way she approached everything that resisted, methodically, with notes. First attempt was too dense. The structure collapsed inward. She diagnosed the problem as underproofing, adjusted the second attempt, and produced something that was technically correct but tasted like an argument. The third attempt was better, but the crust was wrong, which offended her in a way she couldn't entirely explain rationally and therefore documented carefully instead. What exactly is wrong with the crust? He asked, standing at the counter eating a piece that seemed to him like excellent bread. "It's not listening," she said. He waited for her to decide whether that was too metaphorical for someone who prided herself on precision. She decided it wasn't. Crust should be a conversation between outside and inside. This one is just outside. It's performing crust. The bread is performing. Everything performs when it's wrong. He thought about that for a while, eating the technically correct but emotionally absent bread, while she stood at the counter reading through her notes with the specific expression she wore when she had just identified the variable that had been hiding. He'd come to recognize it, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the rest of the face, the look of someone who has stopped searching because they've found. "The temperature," she said. "I've been trusting the temperature in the recipe, and I should have been trusting the bread." "The bread." "Yes, the recipe says 40 minutes, but this bread needs 50. The recipe was written for a different oven. I've been following the recipe, instead of looking at what's in front of me." He put down his piece of bread. "You understand that you just described an error that applies to approximately half of all human problems," he said. She looked at him, then she looked at the bread, then she said very evenly, "I know, don't make it into a thing." He made it internally into a small, beautiful thing, and said nothing. The fourth attempt was right. She knew it when it came out of the oven, the sound the crust made, the color that wasn't almost right but actually right. She cut it, handed him a piece, and watched his face with the focused attention of someone grading a test. "Well," she said. He ate it. He thought about it seriously, the way she deserved it to be thought about. "It's talking to itself," he said. She exhaled, "Yes. This is very good bread." "I know." She documented the conditions in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. Time, temperature, humidity in the flat that day, the specific weight of the flour batch. Everything that had made this attempt different from the other three. Not because she thought she'd need to debug it again, she had solved it, but because she thought that solving something and understanding why you'd solved it were different things, and the second mattered. He read her notes later that evening with permission. They were detailed, dry, precise, and somehow moving in a way he couldn't entirely account for. The care of it. The idea that something as ordinary as bread deserved this level of attention. That the gap between almost right and right was worth the time it took to understand. He wrote in his own notebook, "She trusts what's in front of her." He meant it as the highest possible compliment. There were things he learned about her over time that were not dramatic revelations, but accumulated into a portrait more detailed, and therefore more true than any quick impression could have been. He learned that she was not a morning person in the traditional sense. She woke early, but she needed 30 minutes and one coffee before she was willing to engage with language. This was fine. He used those 30 minutes to read. They sat in the kitchen in a comfortable silence that had taken approximately 2 weeks to stop feeling like it needed to be filled. He learned that she cared about music in a way that was completely separate from her analytical intelligence, that there were certain songs that undid something in her that the rest of her life kept carefully assembled, and that she was not self-conscious about this. She cried at concerts, not theatrically. Just sometimes, the music got in, and she let it, and she didn't apologize for it or explain it. He found this one of the most specifically beautiful things about her, though he'd never quite found the right way to say so without it sounding like a smaller compliment than he meant. He learned that she held grudges against institutions rather than people. She had not returned to a particular restaurant chain since an unacceptable experience 8 years ago. She had a complex and well-documented position on a professional organization in her field that had, in her opinion, made a structural error in 2019 and not adequately addressed it. These grievances were entirely proportionate and completely unrelated to forgiveness. She had no interest in punishing the relevant parties. She simply considered her choices to be a form of information, and her information was that these entities had made errors that she had not forgotten. He learned that, when she was very tired, she became slightly formal, not cold, but precise in a way that was noticeably more deliberate than her usual precision, as if she were conserving energy by eliminating the margin for ambiguity. He found this, also, unexpectedly endearing, though he said nothing about it because he had a sense it would not be received as endearing. He learned that she was afraid of lifts during storms, not phobic, not avoidant, just uncomfortable and honest about it. The combination of enclosed metal and electrical volatility is not irrational to find concerning, she told him, the first time they waited out a storm on a 7th-floor landing rather than taking the lift. He agreed. They took the stairs. She counted them, which was something she did to manage the discomfort, and he counted them with her, which was something he did because it seemed useful. "You don't have to count," she said. "I know," he said. "I like knowing how many stairs there are." She looked at him sideways. "We should count all the staircases we regularly use." "Yes," he said, "let's." They did eventually. He wrote them down. She reviewed the list with satisfaction, the way she reviewed all completed projects, with the calm of a person for whom the completion was never the point, but the knowing was. He thought sometimes about the old poet, about the concept of a soul that passed through time looking for its correct container, about what it would mean to believe that, not metaphorically, not as the kind of pretty idea you tried on and set down, but as a genuine accounting of how consciousness worked. That you were not oneself but many, sequential, each inheriting the grief and the knowledge and the slowly accumulating wisdom of the last. He didn't believe it literally, but he understood, in a way he hadn't before he had the Cantonese word for it, what the idea was reaching toward. The sense that the self was not fixed, not the given, not the tape that plays one track to its end. Something more like a translation, always in process, always approximate, always reaching toward an original that can't quite be accessed directly. He worked on this for a while in the margins of his notebooks. He was writing a translator's essay, not for the classical poetry collection, a different project, something longer and more personal, about the relationship between translation and identity, about what it meant to move language from one container to another and what was inevitably lost, and how that loss was not only loss. How sometimes the constraint of the new container forced a precision that the original hadn't needed because the original had its own language, its own set of assumptions, and could afford to be generous. The translation couldn't afford to be generous. The translation had to choose. He was, he suspected, also writing about himself. This was allowed. The best translators' essays always were. Ewan read a draft of it one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the familiar posture of someone reading something seriously, slight forward lean, occasional stillness that meant she was rereading a sentence. He sat across from her pretending to read something of his own and watched her face. When she finished, she put the pages down and looked at him. "The section about the wandering self," she said, "the one that doesn't have a container." "Yes." "Is that the version of you before?" "Yes." "And you found one?" He looked at her. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Good, I'd hate to think you were still wandering." "You would know," he said. "You'd be able to tell, you'd notice the gap." "I notice everything," she said. "I know you do." She picked up the pages again. "I have 2 notes," she said. "Of course you do. Do you want them?" "Yes." She gave him her 2 notes. They were both correct. He incorporated them. The essay was better. He thanked her. She said, "That's what I'm for." He thought, "No, that's one of the things you're for, and the list is long, and I have been keeping it in a notebook I have not yet shown you, and I don't know if I will, but I want to be the kind of person who keeps that list, who notices, who writes it down, who is here." The city they lived in was old in the way cities that have been rebuilt many times become old. Not ancient, not layered with visible history so much as haunted by the sense of previous arrangements. Streets that had been renamed, buildings that stood where other buildings had stood, a river that ran through the center and was now, in some stretches, underground, invisible but still moving beneath the streets you walked on. Marcus liked this about it. Liked the idea that the ground under your feet contained things you couldn't see. That presence and history were not always visible, that you could live above something very old and not know it was there until you knew where to look. He talked about this once with Ewan, on a Sunday morning, walking along the section of the river that was still above ground, an old section, the banks not yet converted to the efficient concrete of progress, still something like what they'd been when the city was younger. "I think that's why I like this part," he said. "It hasn't been organized yet." "Everything gets organized eventually," she said. "I know, that's why I want to be here before it is." She looked at the water. The river was low with the season, moving with a particular patience that rivers had, the patience of things that understood they would outlast the urgency of everything happening on their banks. She watched it for a while. "My grandmother used to say," she said slowly, the way she spoke when she was pulling something out of a place she didn't often go, that rivers remember everything that's happened on their banks. Not that they record it, just that they remember, that if you were quiet enough you could feel it. He looked at the water. He tried to be quiet enough. "Did you believe her?" he asked. "I was 9. I believed everything she said." "And now?" She considered. "Now I think she was describing something real in a way that 9-year-old me could understand. Rivers are systems. They carry things. Everything that's happened here has been carried in some form into that water. That's not mystical, that's hydrology." "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard you say." She glanced at him, the edge of a smile. "Don't tell anyone." They stood there a while longer. The river moved. The city went on above and around them, organizing itself, naming and renaming its streets, building on what had been built before. The ground held its history. The water remembered. He thought about the old poems, about grief turned into language so it could survive what the body couldn't, about the strange human insistence on making something out of loss, not making it mean something, not making it okay, but making something with it. A bridge, a poem, a translation, a bowl in a specific shade of green, a notebook of bred conditions, a life assembled over time from the materials that were available. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. "Here is what the story is about, if a story has to be about something. It is about the version of yourself that lives in someone else's perception of you, and what happens to that version when the relationship ends. It is about the wandering self, unmoored, looking for a container. It is about the strange grace of being present in your own life, not as an achievement but as a practice, a choice made daily, a direction walked toward rather than a destination arrived at. It is about what happens when you walk out of the wrong thing and nearly knock over the right thing, standing outside in the cold with a green coat and an unmade decision. It is about bread and its structural requirements. It is about staircases and their exact number of steps. It is about the space between almost right, and why that space is worth the time it takes to understand. It is about the river that remembers, the ground that holds, the city that keeps building on what was already there. It is about the word he still didn't have in English, the feeling of a wandering self finding, if not a final resting place, then something warm and specific and chosen, something that kept choosing him back. It is about 2 people in a night market in late spring, one holding a green bowl and one holding a book in a language that resisted translation, both of them present, both of them here, which is the one thing no translation can approximate and no language fully contains. It is about here. Hear this. The warm kitchen, the bread that finally learned to listen to itself, the river below the streets, the Tuesday that became a habit. The coat retrieved at last, still green, still impractical, still exactly right. The hand held in the night market. The words that landed. The door walked through, and the city beyond it, and the walking and the walking and the walking home. The essay came out in a literary journal he'd been trying to get into for 7 years. Not a large journal, not a famous one, but a serious one. The kind that was read by the people whose reading he respected, which was the only metric he'd ever genuinely cared about. The editor wrote him a note that said, "This is the piece we've been looking for someone to write for a long time. Thank you for being the one who wrote it." He read the note twice and put it in the kitchen drawer with the letter from the reader and Ewan's bread notebook. The drawer was becoming a kind of archive. He had not thought of it that way until he opened it one morning looking for a pen and saw the collection. The letter, the note, the notebook, a business card from a translator he'd met at a conference and wanted to stay in contact with, a postcard his sister had sent from somewhere, a small drawing Ewan had made on a napkin during a restaurant conversation about a structural concept she was trying to explain and couldn't quite find the words for. He stood at the open drawer for a moment. This is what it looks like, he thought. Not the life you planned, not the life you performed. The actual accumulation, the things you kept because they mattered, the things you did because they were worth doing, the people who drew you diagrams on napkins when language ran out. He closed the drawer. He made coffee. He sat at the window in the morning light. Outside, someone had planted flowers in the window box of the flat across the street, small yellow things, nothing exotic, the kind that arrived every spring without being remarkable and were remarkable anyway, simply by virtue of being there alive in the returning warmth. He watched them move slightly in the morning air and thought about arrival, about returning, about the poems that opened with the invocation, "O soul, come back." Come back to what exactly? To the place you came from, to the person you were before the wandering, but you couldn't go back. You could only go forward, carrying the wandering in you, changed by it, translating the experience of displacement into something you could use. That was the translation, he thought, not from one language to another, from one version of yourself to the next. The losses carried forward. The grief turned into language. The soul that kept looking until it found something worth looking at and then looked at it very carefully and stayed. He heard Ewan in the other room, the specific sounds of her morning, the particular sequence of activity that he had come to know as well as his own. In a moment she would come into the kitchen for coffee. In 30 minutes she would be ready to talk. Before that, silence, which he respected because it was not personal, because he knew this now, because you could know things about people if you paid attention for long enough and gave the knowing time to become understanding rather than assumption. The city outside the window was beginning its day. The neon signs that had been on all night would stay on until the morning traffic was heavy enough to render them invisible. The river was moving under its streets. The stairs in the buildings of the neighborhood had their numbers, recorded somewhere. He waited for the coffee to finish. He watched the yellow flowers. He prepared, in the quiet way you prepare for ordinary things that are not ordinary, for the day. Ewan came into the kitchen. He poured her coffee. She took it without speaking, because it was still in the 30 minutes, and stood at the window next to him for a moment, looking out. She was wearing the green coat over her pajamas because the morning was cold, and practicality was not something she suspended for aesthetics. The coat looked exactly as it always looked, which was to say exactly right. They stood together at the window and watched the city begin. He thought, "Oh soul, come back." He thought, "I'm back. I've been back for a while. I just needed to learn the word for it." He thought, this is what it means to be present. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic turn. Just this, 2 people in a kitchen in the morning light, 1 coat too many, coffee in hand, watching the city that contains them both go about the ordinary business of being alive. The soul at last in its container. The translation finished. The wandering over. Here,